The day my son asked me to sign over my retirement savings, I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just looked at him across the kitchen table, that same kitchen table I'd sat at 100 times, eating meals I hadn't cooked, in a house where I'd slowly learned to make myself small, and I said quietly, no. He didn't take it well. Mom, he said, setting down his coffee mug a little harder than necessary, it's not like we're asking you to give it away. It's an investment. For the family. I nodded. I'd gotten good at nodding. It had started, as these things usually do, with the best of intentions. 18 months earlier, after my husband Stuart passed, 41 years together, and then one Tuesday morning in November he was simply gone. The house in Sudbury felt enormous. Not large, mind you. It was a modest bungalow, 3 bedrooms, a yard Stuart had tended every summer like it was a second job. But after he died, the room seemed to stretch. The silence took on a physical weight. I'd find myself standing in the hallway at 11 at night, not knowing where I'd been going or why I'd gotten up. My son and his wife had a newer house in the west end of Hamilton. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement. They'd been talking about starting a renovation business. My son had always been handy, and his wife Nadine had the kind of organizational energy that could run a small country. They suggested I come and stay for a while, just to get out of the empty house, just to be around people. I sold the Sudbury bungalow. I put the money, along with Stuart's life insurance and my RRSP, into a GIC at the TD Bank downtown, because that's what Stuart would have done. Keep it safe. Keep it yours. I moved to Hamilton in March with 2 suitcases and a box of books and the small watercolors Stuart had bought me for our 20th anniversary, a painting of Georgian Bay in autumn, all gray water and orange trees. I hung it in the bedroom they gave me, which was the smallest of the 4, at the end of the hall past the laundry room. It was fine. I told myself it was fine. The first few weeks were genuinely nice. Nadine made dinners. My grandchildren, 9-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, would come and sit with me after school and show me things on their tablets. I read them stories at bedtime when their parents were busy. The house was noisy and full of life, and I was grateful for the noise. But I began to notice things. Small things at first, the way Nadine would redirect conversations when I started a sentence. The way my son would look at his phone while I talked, then say, "Sorry, what?" without looking up. The guest bathroom I shared with the children had no hook for a towel. Not a big deal, I told myself. I asked if I could put one up, and Nadine said she'd look into it. That was in April. By August, I was still folding my towel over the shower rod. The heating was worse. My room had a vent, but it was partially blocked by a bookshelf that had been there when I arrived, and which, when I gently mentioned it, my son said he'd move when he had a chance. That first winter, I slept in socks and a cardigan. I bought a small space heater and plugged it in, and Nadine mentioned, not unkindly, but not warmly either, that it would show up on the hydro bill. I unplugged it and bought an extra blanket from the Winners on Barton Street. I want to be fair. My son loves me. I believe that. But love, I've learned, can coexist with a kind of carelessness that wears you down slowly, the way water softens stone. He didn't mean to make me feel invisible. He just stopped seeing me. Nadine was more complicated. She was not cruel. She was efficient. She ran the household the way she planned to run the renovation business, with systems, timelines, and very little room for deviation. Dinner at 6, groceries on Thursdays. Laundry rotations on a schedule posted on the fridge that did not include my laundry, which I learned to do late on Sunday nights when the machine was free. When I offered to cook, she thanked me and said she had a meal plan. When I offered to help with the children, she said she had it handled. When I asked if I could plant a small container garden on the back deck, she said she'd think about it. She always said she'd think about it. I started going for long walks in the mornings, partly because I've always liked walking, and partly because it was the only time I felt like I was in charge of something. I found a library branch 4 blocks away. I found a Ukrainian church that ran a seniors' coffee hour on Wednesday mornings, even though I'm not Ukrainian. The woman who ran it, Helena, waved me in the first time I peered through the window like I was a stray she'd been expecting. I started going every week. That was where I was the morning my son called to say he needed to talk to me. I walked home and he was already at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a folder of papers beside it. Nadine was there too, which told me this wasn't casual. She had the look she got before presenting something composed, prepared, slightly overbright. The renovation business, my son explained, had a real opportunity. A property in Stony Creek, a duplex in rough shape, priced below market. The numbers made sense, he said, turning the laptop toward me. If they could get the financing together quickly before someone else moved on it, they could flip it or rent it. Either way, good return. The bank had pre-approved a certain amount, but not quite enough. They needed a bridge. We're not asking for a gift, Nadine said. It would be a formal loan within the family. We'd document everything properly. How much? I asked. My son told me. It was the majority of what I had in that GIC. I sat with that for a moment. The watercolor of Georgian Bay was visible from where I sat, through the open bedroom door down the hall. Stuart had found it at a gallery in Parry Sound, carried it under his arm on the ferry. He'd paid more than we could afford at the time, and when I'd scolded him about it, gently he'd said, "Some things are worth more than what they cost." If the bank didn't approve the full amount, I said, there's a reason for that. My son started to explain about how banks were conservative, how the asset itself was collateral, how Nadine had already spoken to an accountant. I let him finish. "I'm not going to do it," I said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard since Stuart's last breath. Nadine looked at the table. My son looked at me with an expression I recognized. Not anger exactly, but disappointment sharpened into something harder, the look of someone who had already spent the money in their head. "We took you in," he said. "It came out quieter than I think he intended. But it came out quieter than I think he intended. But it came out. I heard it land. I felt it land. And something in me, something that had been folded up and put away since March, maybe longer, quietly unfolded. You did," I said, "and I'm grateful for that. But that doesn't mean my savings are part of the arrangement." Nadine stood up and excused herself to go check on something. My son closed the laptop. He said he needed some air and went out through the back door, and I sat alone at the kitchen table in a house that had never felt like mine, listening to the furnace run. That evening, nothing was said at dinner. The children talked about their school project, something about ecosystems. I helped with the dishes. I said goodnight and went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Georgian Bay on the wall. I had known, I think, for a while. Not that this particular conversation would happen, but that something would. That the situation had a shape, and I'd been trying not to look directly at it. I called my friend June the next morning from the library because I didn't want to make the call from the house. June had been my closest friend since we'd worked together at the school board in the 90s, and she had a talent for saying true things without cruelty. "How long have you been unhappy there?" she asked, after I'd told her everything. I had to think. "I think since June," I said. "No offense." She laughed. "None taken. What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet. I think I need to figure out what I can do." "Start there then," she said. I made an appointment with a financial advisor at the TD branch on King Street. Not my son's branch, a different one. I sat down with a young woman named, well, she had her name on a little placard, but I was too nervous to retain it, and I explained my situation. I told her I might need to think about renting. I asked about accessing the GIC without a large penalty, whether the term was close enough to maturity. It was 6 weeks away from the maturity date. I could wait 6 weeks. I started looking at listings on my phone, in the library, while Helena's coffee group talked around me. There were bachelor apartments I couldn't picture myself in, and there were places above my budget, and then there was a one-bedroom in a low-rise on the escarpment in Dundas, with a small balcony facing the valley. The building was clean, well-managed, close to a bus route. The property manager was a soft-spoken man named Mr. Osei, who answered every question I asked and didn't rush me. I put in an application. I was approved. I didn't tell my son right away. I needed a few more days. Not out of fear exactly, but out of something like care. I wanted to do it properly, not in the heat of a reaction. I called June again. I called my sister Barbara in New Brunswick, who said, "Finally," which made me laugh so hard I cried a little. Then I sat my son down, just the two of us, in the living room one evening when Nadine had taken the children to swimming lessons. "I found my own place," I said. "I'm moving at the end of the month." He was quiet for a long time. "Because of the money thing." "Not only that. I should have done this sooner. I think we both know this arrangement wasn't quite right, and I don't say that to make you feel bad. I say it because I think it's true." He rubbed the back of his neck the same way he'd done since he was a teenager absorbing something he didn't like, but couldn't argue with. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. It was the most genuinely himself he'd sounded in months. "Yes," I said. "I really think I am." The move took a Saturday and a half. June drove up from Burlington to help. My son helped carry boxes, and he and I didn't say much but worked well together the way we used to when he was young, and we'd rearrange the furniture and not need words for it. Before I left, I stood in the empty guest room for a moment, the indent in the carpet where the bed had been, the nail hole in the wall where Georgian Bay had hung. I'd taken the space heater too. It seemed fair. The apartment in Dundas smelled like fresh paint and somebody else's clean beginning. The balcony faced a long slope of trees, birch and maple, and past them the shadow of the Niagara Escarpment in the November afternoon. I put the kettle on before I unpacked anything else, because that's what Stuart always did when we moved somewhere new. Kettle first, everything else can wait. I was putting books on the shelf, slowly, no hurry, choosing where each one went, when I found the envelope. I hadn't gone through Stuart's writing box in over a year. I brought it from Sudbury without opening it, just set it on the shelf with the books. It was a plain wooden box, the kind that used to hold cigars that he'd kept his loose papers in. Receipts, mostly, old birthday cards, a photograph of his parents on the steps of a church somewhere, and at the bottom, in his handwriting, a white envelope with my name on it, just my name. No occasion, no date. I sat down on the floor, back against the bookshelf, and opened it. It wasn't long. 2 pages, in his careful printing, the kind he used when he wanted to be sure it would be legible. He'd written it, he said at the top, after his first cardiac event 3 years before he died, when the doctor had suggested he think about getting his affairs in order. He'd never given it to me because things had stabilized, and it seemed, he wrote, a bit morbid to hand your wife a letter about dying over dinner. He wrote about the house, about wanting me to be practical about it if I ever needed to sell. He wrote about the money. Not much, he apologized, but enough to matter, and asked me to be careful with it. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he knew I'd have a tendency to give it to people who needed it before taking care of myself. He'd seen it my whole life, he wrote, and he loved me for it, but he wanted better for me. And then, near the end, he wrote this: "You have spent a long time making sure everyone around you had what they needed. I hope you spend whatever time is left making sure you do too, not as a leftover, as the point." I read it twice, there on the floor of my new apartment with the kettle starting to whistle in the kitchen. I let it whistle a little longer. I have a routine now that I didn't have in Hamilton. I wake up when I wake up. I make coffee in the small drip machine I found at the Value Village in Dundas for $4. I read by the window, which looks east and catches the morning light before it turns. On Wednesdays, I still go to Helena's coffee hour. I take the bus now, 40 minutes each way, and I've started to think of it as reading time. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center in Ancaster, which I mention only because it felt like the kind of thing I'd always meant to do and never made time for. My son calls on Sundays. It's a little careful still, a little like walking on new ice, but it's there. He asked me once, about 2 months after I moved, whether I was lonely. I thought about it honestly before answering. "Sometimes," I said, "but it's a different kind of lonely. It's mine." He didn't quite understand that, I think. Maybe he will one day. Stuart's letter lives in the wooden box on my shelf, next to the watercolor of Georgian Bay. Some nights I look at them both and think about how much of a life is just the accumulation of small, quiet choices. Where to put the bookshelf, when to say no, how to hold your ground without making it a war. Your peace is not a consolation prize. It's not what you get when everything else falls through. It's what you were supposed to have all along. I think about that kitchen table a lot, not with bitterness, more the way you think about a place you once got lost in and then found your way out of. I sat at that table and said no, and the world didn't end. My son didn't stop loving me. I didn't stop loving him, but something shifted. The way a door shifts when you finally push it in the right direction. What I've come to understand is that the situation didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, the way most things that matter do. I made small concessions, one after another, each one reasonable on its own. The room at the end of the hall, the laundry on Sunday nights, the space heater unplugged because of the hydro bill. Individually, none of it was terrible. Together, it added up to a life I didn't recognize. And I think that's worth being honest about, because I wasn't a passive victim in that story. I was a participant. I told myself it was fine long past the point when it wasn't, because admitting it wasn't fine felt like ingratitude, and I've never been good at seeming ungrateful. But here's what I've learned about doing the right thing. It rarely feels triumphant in the moment. When I told my son I wasn't going to sign over my savings, I didn't feel strong. I felt tired. I felt sad. I second-guessed myself for days afterward. What I didn't do, and I'm proud of this quietly, was let that uncertainty talk me out of what I knew was true. There's a kind of inner steadiness that has nothing to do with being fearless. It's more like knowing the difference between discomfort and wrongness, and choosing to trust that difference even when you're not sure. I think about Nadine sometimes, too. I don't think she was a bad person. I think she had a plan. And I fit into it in a particular way, and when I stopped fitting, she didn't know what to do with me. That's human. What I refused to do was make myself smaller to resolve her discomfort. There's a difference between being kind and being accommodating to the point of self-erasure. I spent too many years blurring that line. Stuart understood something I had to relearn. He wrote it in that letter, the one I found on the floor of my new apartment with the kettle whistling, that I had a tendency to give to others before I gave to myself, and that he loved me for it. But he wanted better for me. Reading those words, I felt both seen and gently corrected by someone who was no longer there to say it in person. That's its own kind of grace. The apartment in Dundas is quiet in a way that Hamilton never was. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that leaves room for your own thoughts. I've started painting again. My watercolors are not very good, but they're getting less bad, which feels like enough. I'm not sure I could have found my way here without being pushed, and I'm not sure the pushing was entirely unkind, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. What I know is that I had to decide, not once, but every day for a while, that my life was worth arranging around my own needs, not as an afterthought, but as the starting point. That decision didn't come from stubbornness. It came from finally paying attention to what I'd known for a long time but hadn't been ready to act on, and acting on it even when it was hard, even when it cost me something. That, I think, is what it means to take yourself seriously. It's not too late to do that. It's never been too late.